Now, famous Philadelphia, when most of you probably think of the Philadelphia in the age of democratic revolution, you think about the 1770s and 80s, when the city played host to the Constitutional Convention, or the signing of the Declaration of Independence when it served as the federal capital in the 1790s. I want to introduce another Philadelphia of a slightly later era, one at the opening decades of the 19th century, and the city's role in helping to nurture the independence movements throughout Central and South America. Hence the title of this talk, La Famosa Philadelphia. The term was coined by a revolutionary figure, probably most of you have never heard much about, Vicente Rocco Fuerte, later to become the first president of the independent Republic of Ecuador. In June 1821, Rocco Fuerte came to Philadelphia, hoping to learn something about its system of government of the fledgling United States, and also to familiarize himself with the deeds and exploits of the nation's founding fathers. And over the next 3 years, Rocco Fuerte visited the schools in Philadelphia, its hospitals, its jail, other public institutions, which as a child of the Enlightenment he believed should form the foundations of a modern democratic society. He also forged relationships with some of the city's educated men and a large group of Spanish Americans who, like himself, had settled in Philadelphia in order to gain insights into American democracy through direct personal observation before Tocqueville. On the basis of these experiences, Rocco Fuerte wrote and published various political treatises in the city, including this one, which translates, do I have it here? No, I don't have it here. Including this one, which translates, its title is Ideas Necessary to Anyone in Independent America Who Wants to Be Free. And in addition to offering arguments in favor of independence of Spain's American territories, that treatise included translations into Spanish of Thomas Paine's famous revolutionary pamphlet, Common Sense, translation of the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, as well as the Federal Constitution. Now, scholars who've analyzed this treatise in search of Rocco Fuerte's Republican ideas have generally skipped over its prologue, which includes a homage to Philadelphia itself. And I put it up in Spanish, but I'll translate it for you. He writes, "Where can I find memories more sublime, lessons more heroic and more worthy of imitation, and examples more analogous to our current situation than in this famous Philadelphia? Yes, in this very city, asylum of the oppressed, center of knowledge, bastion of liberty, the genius of independence, on the 4th of July, 1776, raised its august voice." Now, 6 months ago, when I first stumbled upon these words, I was astonished. I've been living in the city for just about 10 years, not far from the house where Rocco Fuerte once lived. And despite having attended countless seminars and conferences on the different ways the city contributed to the history of the United States, never once did anyone refer to this famous quote, this reference to La Famosa Philadelphia. Now, what especially interests me about this quote is the way that Rocco Fuerte defines Philadelphia. He doesn't invoke the physical characteristics of the city, its urbe, nor does he talk about the character of its inhabitants, its civitas. Rather, he sees it as a symbol, an idea, notio in Spanish. More specifically, he sees it as a metaphor for liberty, for democracy, for the kind of independent republic that Rocco Fuerte, together with other Spanish-American revolutionaries, sought to create. Now, in recent years, historians have written widely about the history of the Atlantic world during the Revolutionary era, representing it, as indeed it was, an interconnected world, marked by the movement of ships, goods, people, both free and enslaved, along with such killer diseases as yellow fever. Many of these scholars have also examined the role that ports played in these exchanges. And it's therefore striking, at least to me, that studies focus on the exchange of ideas, especially revolutionary ideas, have seemingly forgotten or at least downplayed the importance of individual cities as places that facilitated their spread. And for this reason, in this morning's talk, I want to emphasize the importance of place, especially with reference to Philadelphia's role as a physical place and as a notio in the Hispanic world during its revolutionary era. Now, a few brief facts about this Philadelphia. Despite the move of the federal capital to Washington in 1800, the city didn't really suffer, quite the opposite. Population continued to grow, 100,000 by 1820. The city also remained an important financial capital, owing in part to the presence here of the first Bank of the United States just down there on 3rd Street. And the city's economy continued to prosper, thanks to its flourishing port and growing trade with the Southern Hemisphere. Around 1810, for example, Philadelphia accounted for over 1/3 of the commerce between the U.S. and Spanish America, a position it maintained for another 20 years. Now, in light of the city's prominent role in Atlantic commerce, it's not surprising that visitors from Spanish America were keen to point out the city's many virtues. Already in 1793, the future Venezuelan revolutionary Francisco de Miranda called it, and I quote, "the most agreeable and well-ordered city in the whole world," singling out the uniformity and regularity of the tree-lined and paved streets, all straight and cut at right angles. Tocqueville perhaps didn't like the grid plan. Miranda did. Of course, it was modeled upon the Spanish city of Santo Domingo, founded in 1502. Miranda was also struck by the good taste and plain and simple architecture of the city's houses and by their gardens as well. Now, of course, Philadelphia was no utopia. Miranda groused about the absence of theater and public entertainments in the quiet Quaker city. But these shortcomings were seemingly offset by the city's other attractions. Private parties where Miranda, speaking French, mingled with wealthy merchants, leading scientists, he mentions David Rittenhouse, and politicians of the stature of George Washington. He also refers to some pretty girls whose flirtatiousness, coquetería in Spanish, attracted his attention. At the same time, Miranda anticipated the city later described by Rocco Fuerte when he referred to Philadelphia as one in which all religions and sects are permitted. The city's wise governance, then, also impressed both Miranda and Rocco Fuerte, along with the Mexican insurgent Jose Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, when he arrived here in 1812 in search of ideas, financial support, and recruits for a military expedition he was preparing in order to liberate Texas from Spanish control. The visitor from Mexico was equally taken with the quality of the city's public hospital. Its prison, not the one that Olivier Zantz described, but the previous one just up here on Walnut Street. He also praised its cultural institutions that had earned Philadelphia the reputation of being the Athens of America, notably Peale's Museum, with its impressive collection of naturalia and portraits of the Founding Fathers, all of whom he considered worthy examples of the political virtue that the name Philadelphia evoked. And other Spanish-American visitors made reference to the city's public library, the library company, and also a little institution known as the Philosophical Society. Now, other aspects of the city that Spanish-American visitors regularly noticed, and that would later form part of Rocco Fuerte's depiction of Philadelphia as a bastion of liberty, were its vibrant public sphere and flourishing print industry. Gutierrez de Lara made reference to the former in the guise of a coffee house, possibly this one. This one, where the news was daily discussed. News that included reports on the progress of Mexico's anti-monarchist uprising and the subject of an article in the Aurora, a Philadelphia newspaper that openly promoted the cause of Spanish-American independence. Now, the Aurora's fixation on Spanish-American current affairs stemmed principally from the political concerns of its Scottish-born proprietor, William Duane. Yet Duane was far alone in these concerns. Owing partly to the city's important trade links with Spanish America, a bevy of other Philadelphia publishers catered to that same market, regularly editing books printed in Spanish for export to various parts of the Spanish-American world. These books range from classics, Cervantes' Don Quixote, for example, to English grammar books and various commercial guides. And these same publishers, Mather Carey, an APS member among them, also proved willing to print, once again in Spanish, propagandistic treatises aimed at that very same market. In this respect, Philadelphia functioned much like a huge, albeit somewhat subversive, bookstore, a kind of Amazon and Barnes & Nobles wrapped into one that was marketing subversive treatises aimed at the broader Spanish-American world. Now, the freedom of the press, combined with the city's prosperity, its cosmopolitan air, its open and vibrant public sphere, democratic institutions, these were all integral to the Famosa Philadelphia Rocco Fuerte would later evoke. No surprise then that Philadelphia served as a crossroads, both transatlantic and transhemispheric, a powerful magnet, one that, in addition to attracting European immigrants in search of a new life in North America, attracted a wide range of dissidents, malcontents, and refugees, all keen to learn something about the American democracy that Philadelphia embodied. One called it a great Noah's Ark, another a grand hotel, or a place of refuge for outsiders seeking to escape the raging storms of the world. Now, many of these outsiders were French, nobles and landowners, merchants fleeing the upheavals in their native country, as well as those in Haiti, or what was then the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Others hailed from Spain, among them a guy called Santiago Felipe Puglia. Born, educated in Italy, he arrived in Philadelphia from the Spanish port of Cadiz in July 1790. Once settled here, Puglia worked as a language teacher, a bookkeeper, an official interpreter for the state of Pennsylvania. He became an American citizen, later claiming that his only homeland was, I quote, the land where true liberty reigns, as the immortal Dr. Franklin used to say. It was also in Philadelphia that Puglia discovered the work of Thomas Paine, a writer he praised for, and I quote, his rare talent, outstanding sincerity, and fervent desire to promote the happiness of men, and one whose ideas about liberty inspired Puglia's book, El Desengaño del Hombre, which he translated as Man Undeceived, a treatise whose publication in 1794 was generally underwritten by the French minister to the United States, Edouard Genet, along with such other notables as Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and the governor of Pennsylvania. Puglia himself described his book as a frontal attack upon the galling yoke of despotism embodied in Spain's Bourbon monarchy. He also promoted it as one that championed the need for democracy, the only system of governments, in his view, that was capable of guaranteeing liberty and equality for both men and women alike. And on this score, Puglia is worth remembering as an early advocate of women's rights. I quote, in English, when God gave Eve to Adam, he asserted, it was on the understanding that she was to be his companion and not a servant or a slave. Consequently, he, that is God, declared that the right of one partner is equal to that of another. Boom, powerful quote. In addition, Puglia insisted on the separation between the spiritual and the temporal, the sacred and the profane, arguing that whenever these joined forces and religion united with the state, their offspring would wreak confusion, wars, and destruction, along with such monsters as the Inquisition, mortal enemy of our people. Now, when Spanish authorities in Cuba and Mexico first encountered Puglia's book, they immediately sounded the alarm about the dangers of this evil work, laboring its author someone who, from a small corner of the world, Philadelphia, blows his hoarse trumpet to incite the most monstrous rebellion, the most colossal treason, a horrendous anarchy among the faithful peoples of the Spanish nation. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the head of the Spanish legation attempted without success to persuade the Secretary of State to order Puglia's arrest, even though the legation's own secretary, adopting a more realistic attitude, recognized that in such a libertine country as this one, where the laws are on the side of the people, one has no other choice but to shut out the shamelessness of the insolent. Now, Puglia wasn't far from the only insolent emigre to take advantage of his residence in this small corner of the world to plan attacks on the Spanish monarchy. Another, even more influential, was Manuel de Torres y Trujillo, formerly a successful trader and landowner in Bogota. He found his way here in 1795, initially earning a living by teaching Spanish, later as a merchant, specializing in trade between the United States and Spanish America. And in addition to writing several books on the topic, he also published, albeit anonymously, a Spanish language textbook that touted the many virtues of republicanism on the basis of what he observed that was happening here in the United States. And in his spare time, Torres played host to what was called the Philadelphia Circle. It was a tertulia in Spanish, a salon in French, a kind of gathering place for dozens of other Spanish-American refugees who, starting around 1810, filtered into Philadelphia in search of both money and ideas. One was Manuel Lorenzo de Vidaurre, who took advantage of his time here to develop his so-called Plan of Peru, a screed for the governance of an independent democratic Peru whose constitution he later helped to write. Vidaurre also evoked the political atmosphere of Torres' circle by recalling, and I quote, "with pleasure the days we spent in Philadelphia, studying the literature of that country and venerating its customs, he wrote, the sacred rules taught by the fathers from the first and most precious book." Now, only a few details of Vidaurre's stay in Philadelphia are known today. The same is true of Torres' tertulia. Some refugees joined it simply to improve their English, to learn about the workings of democracy. Others, taking advantage of introductions provided by Torres, made contact with wealthy Philadelphia merchants willing to sell them muskets and other munitions. And still others, as with Vidaurre, made use of Torres' contacts and his money to locate Philadelphia publishers willing to print their propagandistic treatises for export. And there was many such works, too many to mention today, but the most influential included La Independencia de la Costa Firme by the Venezuelan revolutionary Manuel García de Sena. In addition to translation of parts of Paine's Common Sense, this work included others of the state constitutions of Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut, meant to help Peruvians and Venezuelans, I should say, form their own constitutions. Now, Spanish authorities did their best to confiscate copies of this inflammatory treatise whenever they could, but copies filtered their way into various parts of South America, and according to the American consul in Buenos Aires, it was read by nearly everyone who can read. Equally scandalous in Spanish eyes was El Triunfo de la Libertad sobre el Despotismo by Juan Germán Rocío, another revolutionary who spent time in Philadelphia. And then there was the exiled Mexican friar who prepared a new edition of Bartolomé de las Casas' infamous 16th century treatise, a brief account of the destruction of the Indies, in order to draw attention to Spain's long record of atrocities in the Americas. All in all, Torres' home was a veritable beehive of diverse activities, a place that Luis de Orniz, Spain's minister in the U.S., regarded as a place where obstinate revolutionaries gathered to foment seditious ideas, as well as to recruit adventurers to help liberate Mexico and other parts of Spanish America. And with the help of spies and various paid commissioners, Orniz kept a close eye on the activities of the members of this circle, reportedly going so far in 1814 as to hire an assassin to kill Torres. He also did his best to promote and protect Spanish territorial interests in the Americas with pamphlets and newspaper reports, and occasionally he persuaded some of these revolutionaries to return to the monarchist cause with the promise of a pardon and other rewards. But as Onís himself fully recognized, he was swimming against the tide. Philadelphia's staunchly Republican brand of wise politics strongly favored the independence movements. Duane's Aurora regularly published articles promoting the emancipation of South America from the diabolical bondage of the Spain and its Inquisition. And much to Onís' regret, Duane also called for new republics founded on the equal rights of mankind and calculated to assure the liberty and happiness of the human species. And in a series of articles printed under the rubric of Machiavellism and ghosts written by Torres, the paper also attacked, I jumped ahead. Where's that? He attacked the lobbying efforts of the Chevalier d'Onís to discredit the work of the patriots. Now, Onís would have been equally upset by the general rejoicing that erupted in the city when news in 1812 arrived that Mexican insurgents had successfully stormed the port of Veracruz in Mexico. From his perspective, that rejoicing amounted to nothing less than the fanaticism of Philadelphia. The fanaticism he believed most of its citizens embraced. And more such, I got this out of whack. More such fanaticism could be heard on the toasts that were offered by various groups of Philadelphians who gathered here every 4th of July to celebrate the country's independence. Most of these toasts honored Washington, Franklin, along with the other democratic heroes of the young United States. Yet starting in 1810, others lauded the noble exertions of the patriots of South America to emancipate their country from the shackles of despotism and superstition. And the language of other toasts was even more flowery. And this is the worst one. May the bolts of lightning from the temple of liberty built by our fathers illume with their shining rays our enslaved and brutalized brethren to the south. Hurrah, hurrah, liberty. Poor Luis de Onís. Upon hearing such words, I can imagine him covering his ears, a response that reflected the earlier suggestion of the legation secretary that it was best not to listen to the shamelessness of the insolent. Breeding ground for ideas, printing press, some subversive bookstore, supplier of arms for the cause of independence, asylum for revolutionaries, with Torres playing orchestrator-in-chief. La Famosa, Philadelphia, was all this. To be sure, there is much more to be learned about the activities of these characters, along with the activities of counter-revolutionaries hired by the Spanish minister. Yet at this stage of my research, one thing is already clear. Although Philadelphia was physically located on the periphery of the Spanish Atlantic throughout the era of independence, metaphorically speaking, it stood at its very center, symbol of the democracy that Spanish Americans who sought refuge here were eager to transplant to their own particular corner of that very same world. Do I have a minute? One more thing. Finally, with regard to Torres, perhaps the guy that did more than anybody else to nurture this image of Philadelphia, there's still much more to learn about this guy. The other members of the Philadelphia Circle came and went, but this guy remained in his house on 10th Street until he moved to the city's outskirts just a few months before his death at the age of 59 in July 1822. By then, besides having been appointed chargé des affaires to the United States by the new government of Gran Colombia, Torres was often known as the Franklin of South America. And such was his reputation that he was buried here with full military honors in his grave in the graveyard or the churchyard of St. Mary's Church on 4th Street, and his funeral attended by a crowd of high society people, many of whom had undoubtedly supported Torres during his time in the city and who evidently helped make Philadelphia famosa. Many thank you. Many thanks.
Thank you. Questions?
Doug Massey, Princeton University. Did any of Torres' letters or to his correspondents or his correspondents themselves mention the inherent contradiction in the United States between a Constitution that permitted liberty but also slavery?
No, not that I know of. Most of the letters that survive, they're in Bogota to merchants. They're looking for arms shipments for the most part. They're desperate for money and munitions. In the first constitutions of Gran Colombia and Venezuela, they freed slaves. But the language of slavery, for the most part, I haven't found it in his private correspondence. We don't have a lot of it. I'm still looking for it.